Before we start comparing the lenses, yes, I did not get the 35mm f1.8 because I think it is just too close to the 50mm for my purposes. I think a wide angle 24mm and a close-up 50mm is good enough. Of course, it'll look much cooler if I have all three of the lenses, but I'm trying to be more practical and more careful on my budget. If you have all three, good for you. Let's get straight to the point. We'll start off by comparing the flares between 24mm and 50mm anamorphic lens from Sirui. The first lens that we're looking at is the 50mm f1.8. As you can see, when I move the light source across the screen, you have a very solid blue lens flare going all the way across the screen. Sometimes it'll turn into two lines, but that's okay. It's still very solid. Both of them are very solid. And the color, it's a really solid blue. Even if I'm moving it across the screen, the lens flare color and quality or how solid it is stays pretty reasonably consistent. You'll be surprised when I show you the 24mm. So let's jump to the 24mm f2.8. This is the 24mm f2.8. And you can immediately tell that the lens flare, it's not as solid. It's kind of scattered all over the place. You have one, this one is not even solid. The blue one is not even solid. You have a bright spot and some lighter or dimmer spot, and you have some other color of lens flare showing up. When I move the light source across the screen, you can tell that you get a kind of solid blue flare when the light source is in the middle of the lens. And when it gets to the edge, like let's say the bottom edge, you get multiple lens flares and they're not consistent in terms of color. But that's probably because they can't make the lens flare consistent with a ultra wide or wide angle lens. It's probably more difficult. So I'm not complaining here. I'm just showing you the difference. And you might also notice that when the light source get closer to the bottom or the top edge, there's a very obvious bending going on with the flare. This is also due to the wide angle at 24mm. So when I move the light source closer to the bottom, you can see that we have more layers of lens flare, and also the bending of the lens flare is very obvious. This is almost doing a reverse distortion of a wide angle lens, because a wide angle lens, usually the distortion goes this way, but now we're having a distortion in the reverse way. Basically, it's bending the other way. If I move the light source to the top, you can tell that this is also bending the light source. You can obviously tell that it goes from bending this way to the opposite. Now that the flare, it's bending this way. It's curving downward. Compared to the 50mm has a way more solid lens flare, and the distortion is there. You can tell that there's a distortion going on still, but then the distortion is much less obvious compared to the 24mm. So that's the major difference. And I feel like the lens flare, it's a little bit too hazy. I don't know if that's a word, but then it makes the image a little bit more washed out on the 24mm compared to the 50. Probably because I had to go closer to the lens in order to produce such a strong flare. Compared to the 50mm, I was away from the lens, obviously a little bit further. But that's another thing. With a 24mm, you can't really get a strong lens flare unless you're closer to the lens. So that's another thing. With the 50mm, because it's a close-up lens, you can get the strong lens flare even when you're standing a little bit further away from the lens. But with the 24mm, you have to get a little bit closer, or else the lens flare will be really tiny. And it will not be across the screen like this, because depending on how strong your light, of course, but then usually it's going to be less obvious and less strong compared to the 50mm. So those are the major differences between the 50mm and the 24mm in terms of lens flare. When it comes to low light performance, since the 50mm f1.8 is a little bit more than one stop brighter than the 24mm, the low light performance is pretty obviously better with the 50mm. Here's the comparison between the 50mm f1.8 and the 24mm f2.8 wide open. I've set the exposure so the 50mm f1.8 it's about the same as what I can see with my own eyes, so you know how much darker the 24mm is. If you want some nice oval-shaped bokeh balls, you will be much better off with the 50mm f1.8 mainly because of its focal length. The oval bokeh on the 24mm is not going to be as tall and as obvious. Here's a comparison using both lenses at its minimum focus distance to showcase the biggest bokeh balls. Remember, if the subject you focus on is further away, the bokeh balls will only be smaller and less oval. Let's talk about color accuracy. I'll be using the X-Ray color checker for video this time for the comparison. Alright, this time we're going to take a look at color accuracy between the 50mm and 24mm. Again, the first image is the 50mm f1.8 and the second image is the 24mm. Let's compare them side by side without looking at any charts yet. This is 24, this is 50. 24, 50. Without even looking at the chart, you can tell right away that the color temperature, at least on the 24mm, is way warmer than the 50. The 50 one is a much cooler lens, or a much of a blue tone compared to the yellow tone of the 24mm. Remember, I did not correct any colors at all. I just boosted the saturation directly from the camera image, and I'm showing you guys out of the box kind of color accuracy. And I feel like I'm more leaning toward the cooler tone, but let's take a look at the chart. So from here, we can see that on the left-hand side of my screen, I have all the charts. I have this vector scope. Let's focus on the vector scope when I move to the 24mm. This is the 50mm f1.8. When I move to the 24mm, you can see, focus on the dot in the middle. If it shifts, that means they have main color differences. Look at this. This is a 24mm, 50, 24, 50. You can see that this dot shift a little bit toward yellow entirely, completely for the 24mm. So this is 50. It shifts toward this way. So that's why the entire image, it's a little bit more yellowish. And other than that, all the other colors stays pretty consistent. I would say it's only the entire thing got shift towards yellow. So just watch out when you are filming with these two lenses. I think the 35mm f1.8, it's also different. I think the 35, it's a little bit more yellow as well compared to the 50. Maybe the 50, because that was the first lens that they produced. So that's why they were trying to figure out the coding and stuff, and the color became like super blue compared to the other lenses. So remember, if you are filming with more than one of these lenses, make sure you use a color checker or a color chart before you start filming with the new lens when you mount it onto the camera, because if you don't use a color checker, then you might be thrown off by the difference in terms of at least color temperature between these two lenses. So 50mm, a little bit cooler, 24mm, much warmer. If you want to know the difference between the 24mm and 50mm in terms of VO of field, here's a quick comparison with the equivalent full frame measurements. Of course, you can see much more with the 24mm, but the 50mm is much nicer when it comes to close-ups. Again, that's why I got the 24mm and 50mm together. Another very important difference between the Sirui 24mm and 50mm is the minimum focus distance. They are both not that close, but they are much better than a lot of other anamorphic lenses already. The 24mm has a minimum focus distance of about 2 feet based on our test, and the 50mm is about 3 feet. Again, not really minimal if you compare it to normal cine or photo lenses. If you want to improve the minimum focus distance, the cheapest way is to add a diopter in front of the lens. They are like magnifying glass and they are usually not that expensive. But there's one thing to keep in mind when using a diopter. They are usually very thick and heavy, and some of them will turn your lens into like a macro lens where a big part of your image will be blurry. So just try it out if you can before buying one. Image compression wise, as I said before, I always like to film with a longer focal length because of the compression and separation of the subject with the background. Here's a comparison between the 24mm and the 50mm in terms of compression. I kept the aperture on both lenses at f2.8 just to be fair because aperture does affect compression too. Since both of the Sirui 24mm and 50mm are known as budget anamorphic lenses, you'll probably be using it with a budget matte box like the Tilta Mini matte box. With a 50mm, obviously there will be no vignetting at all. With the 24mm, there's no vignetting as well, which is great news. Physically, the 24mm f2.8 is about 1 inch taller than the 50mm f1.8. The 24mm is also heavier than the 50mm, but it is not that much heavier unless you compare them side by side. But you will most likely not notice the difference when filming with just one of them. Both lenses are made of metal, so they definitely feel heavy with such a compact size. The 24mm is also a little fatter than the 50mm, like bigger in terms of the diameter. The front filter size on the 50mm is only 67mm and it is 72mm on the 24mm. I think that is perfect because I only have these two Sirui lenses and now I don't have to share the adapter ring for the Tilta Mini matte box. The focus ring on both lenses are very similar. They are both very smooth and easy to pull focus with. The aperture ring on the 50mm is known to be too close to the camera body and it is very hard to change the aperture. The aperture ring on the 24mm is about 1 inch away from the mount, which is much more comfortable when adjusting the aperture. I'm not sure if it is just my copy of the lenses or if it's the same for all the lenses. The aperture ring on the 24mm is noticeably stiffer to turn compared to the 50mm. The aperture ring on the 50mm is almost as smooth as the focus ring, but the aperture ring on the 24mm requires more effort to turn. That's it. Those are the main differences between the Sirui 24mm f2.8 and 50mm f1.8 anamorphic lenses. If you want to start making anamorphic videos, I have two suggestions for you. First, if you have limited budget, you should get the 35mm f1.8 because that focal length should be the most versatile. A 35mm 1.33 times anamorphic lens should give you a view similar to 50mm horizontally. The compression will also be very natural as well. If you have a little bit more budget, you can definitely consider getting the 24mm first, then the 50mm for different looks. To me, the image they create has big enough differences, and that's why I got them both. If you have a lot of budget, which is awesome, get all three of them because they are worth about the same as one anamorphic lens from other brands. Let us know what you think if you have any of the anamorphic lenses from Sirui or if you are planning to get one. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.